The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse settled slowly in the morning heat as he crested the ridge overlooking Willow Creek. What he saw below made his blood run cold. 7 Apache women, their hands bound behind their backs, stood beneath the gnarled branches of an old oak tree. Rough hemp nooses dangled ominously above their heads while a crowd of angry townspeople gathered around them, shouting for justice. Jake had been riding the range for 3 days, searching for stray cattle that had wandered from the Double M Ranch. The last thing he expected was to stumble upon what looked like a lynching party. His weathered hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip as he studied the scene below. Something didn't feel right about this whole situation. The women appeared to be sisters, their faces bearing similar strong features and proud-bearing despite their dire circumstances. The eldest couldn't have been more than 25, while the youngest looked barely 16. They stood with dignity, refusing to show fear even as the crowd grew more restless and vengeful. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood nearby, his badge catching the morning sun, but he wasn't doing anything to stop the mob. In fact, he seemed to be encouraging them. Jake had known Bradley for years, and the man had always been fair and law-abiding. This behavior struck Jake as completely out of character. "They murdered the Patterson family in cold blood," shouted one man from the crowd. "Burned their homestead to the ground and stole everything they could carry. Savages don't deserve a trial," yelled another. "String them up now and be done with it." Jake spurred his horse down the slope, his mind racing. He had heard about the Patterson murders 2 weeks ago when he was in town for supplies. It had been a brutal attack that left a family of 5 dead, including 2 young children. The whole territory was on edge, demanding someone pay for the crime, but as Jake drew closer, he noticed details that troubled him deeply. The Apache women's clothing was clean and showed no signs of recent travel or violence. Their horses, tied nearby, were well cared for and bore no evidence of being laden with stolen goods. Most telling of all, their hands showed no traces of soot or ash that would be expected if they had recently burned down a homestead. "Hold up there," Jake called out as he rode into the crowd. "What's the rush? Since when do we hang people without a proper trial in this territory?" Sheriff Bradley turned toward him, and Jake was shocked to see fear flickering in the lawman's eyes. "Stay out of this, Morrison. These women are killers and the people demand justice." "The people demand blood, you mean," Jake replied, dismounting from his horse. "But I'm not seeing any evidence here. Where are the stolen goods? Where's the proof these women committed any crime?" A well-dressed man in an expensive stepped forward from the crowd. Jake didn't recognize him, but something about the stranger's confident demeanor and calculating eyes set off alarm bells in his mind. The man had the look of someone used to getting his way through intimidation and money rather than honest work. "I'm Clayton Thornfield," the man announced. "I represent the Territorial Land Development Company. These savages have been terrorizing settlers and disrupting our expansion plans for months. The Patterson murders were just the latest in a string of attacks." Jake studied Thornfield carefully. The man's boots were polished and expensive, hardly the footwear of someone who spent time in the frontier wilderness. His hands were soft and uncalloused, clearly unused to manual labor. This was a man who made his living with paperwork and backroom deals, not honest frontier work. "Funny thing," Jake said slowly, "I've been riding this range for 5 years, and I've never seen these women before today. If they've been causing trouble for months, seems like someone would have mentioned it." The eldest of the Apache sisters caught Jake's eye and spoke in clear, unaccented English. "We came here peacefully to trade. We have done no harm to anyone. This man," she gestured toward Thornfield, "offers gold for our deaths." "Lies," Thornfield snapped. "Don't listen to the savage's desperate words." But Jake was listening, and what he heard rang with truth. The woman's voice was steady and sincere, without the desperation of someone caught in a lie. Her English was too perfect for someone who lived isolated from white settlements, suggesting these women had regular peaceful contact with settlers. "Sheriff," Jake said, turning back to Bradley, "I'm calling for a proper investigation. These women deserve their day in court, same as any white person would." Bradley's face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "The evidence is clear, Jake. We found them near the burned homestead. Near it, or at it? There's a big difference." Jake's voice carried the authority of someone used to taking charge in difficult situations. "And since when do we hang people for being in the general area of a crime?" The crowd was growing restless, but Jake noticed that several of the townspeople were beginning to look uncertain. These were decent folks who wanted justice, not a mindless lynching. They were starting to have doubts about the rushed proceedings. Thornfield stepped closer to Jake, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake, Cowboy. There are powerful interests at work here that you don't understand. Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." The threat was thinly veiled, but Jake had faced down rustlers, hostile wildlife, and prairie storms. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a well-dressed land speculator with soft hands and empty threats. "The only mistake I see here is 7 innocent women about to be murdered by a mob," Jake replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And I won't stand by and watch it happen." As tension mounted in the crowd, Jake noticed movement in the trees beyond the gathering. More riders were approaching, and something about their coordinated movement suggested they weren't casual observers. His hand moved closer to his gun as he realized this situation was about to become much more complicated and dangerous. The riders emerging from the tree line wore no badges or identifying marks, but their coordinated approach and the way they positioned themselves around the crowd told Jake everything he needed to know. These weren't concerned citizens or lawmen. They were hired guns, and they were here to make sure the hanging proceeded as planned. Jake counted 8 men, all armed with rifles and positioned strategically to control the crowd and eliminate any opposition. Their leader, a grizzled man with a distinctive scar running down his left cheek, dismounted and walked directly to Thornfield. The 2 men exchanged brief words before the scarred man nodded and took up position near the tree. "Folks," the gunman called out, "my name's Frank Dalton, and I'm here representing territorial interests. This hanging needs to proceed immediately. Anyone who interferes will be dealt with accordingly." The threat sent a chill through the crowd, and Jake saw several townspeople backing away nervously. These were shopkeepers, farmers, and settlers, not gunfighters. They wanted justice, but they weren't prepared to die for it. Sheriff Bradley's hands were visibly shaking now, and Jake realized the lawman was trapped in something much bigger than a simple murder case. The fear in his eyes wasn't fear of the crowd or even the Apache women. It was fear of the men who had orchestrated this entire situation. "Sheriff," Jake said quietly, stepping closer to Bradley, "this isn't justice. You know it, and I know it. Help me stop this before innocent blood is spilled." Bradley's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand, Jake. These men, they own half the territorial government. Cross them, and you'll end up in a shallow grave somewhere out on the prairie." "Maybe so," Jake replied, "but I can live with dying for doing what's right." "Can you live with watching 7 innocent women hang for crimes they didn't commit?" Before Bradley could respond, the eldest Apache sister spoke again. "My name is Ayanna, and these are my sisters. We came to trade horses with the Patterson family 3 days ago, but found only ashes and death. We stayed to pray for their spirits and were preparing to leave when these men found us." Her words rang with sincerity, and Jake noticed several details that supported her story. The women's horses were indeed fine animals, the kind that would be valuable in trade. More importantly, they carried traditional Apache goods like hand-woven blankets and silver jewelry, items that would be offered in peaceful trade rather than taken in a raid. Thornfield stepped forward angrily. "Enough of these lies? We have witnesses who saw these savages fleeing the scene." "What witnesses?" Jake demanded. "I don't see anyone here who stepped forward to testify." The land speculator's face flushed red, but before he could respond, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. "I was there that night, and I didn't see no Apache women." All eyes turned toward an elderly prospector named Samuel Jenkins, who pushed through the crowd with his characteristic limp from an old mining accident. Sam was known throughout the territory as an honest man who feared nothing and no one. "I was camped about 2 miles from the Patterson place," Sam continued. Heard the gunshots and saw the fire. Rode over as fast as I could, but whoever did it was long gone. Found tracks leading away from the homestead, but they weren't Apache ponies. They were shod horses, the kind white men ride. The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd, but Dalton quickly stepped forward. Old man's probably drunk or confused. Everyone knows prospectors can't be trusted. Sam's weathered face hardened. I may be old, son, but my eyes work just fine. And I don't drink when I'm working a claim. Those tracks were from at least 6 riders, all heading north toward the mountain passes. No Apache war party uses that route. Jake felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. North toward the mountain passes. That's where the new railroad survey is being conducted, isn't it, Thornfield? The land speculator's face went pale, and Jake knew he had hit upon something significant. The railroad meant money, lots of it, and men like Thornfield would stop at nothing to secure the most profitable routes and land deals. The Patterson homestead sits right in the path of the proposed railroad line, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger as the pieces connected. With the family dead and no heirs, that land becomes available for territorial acquisition. Very convenient for your development company. You're talking nonsense, Thornfield snapped. But his nervous glance toward Dalton betrayed his anxiety. Ayanna spoke again, her voice carrying across the crowd. We saw riders that night heading north, as the old man says. 6 white men with guns and torches. We hid in the rocks and watched them pass. They spoke of money and land grants, of clearing out homesteaders who wouldn't sell. Her revelation caused an uproar in the crowd. Several townspeople began shouting questions, demanding to know more about these mysterious riders and their connection to the Patterson murders. Jake saw his opportunity and pressed his advantage. Sheriff Bradley, I'm formally requesting that you postpone this hanging until a proper investigation can be conducted. We have witness testimony that contradicts the charges against these women. Bradley looked torn between his duty as a lawman and his fear of the powerful interests arrayed against him. Sweat poured down his face as he struggled with the decision. Dalton ended the sheriff's internal debate by drawing his gun. Enough talk. The hanging proceeds now. But Jake was ready for the move. His own Colt cleared leather faster than Dalton could aim, and the 2 men faced each other in a deadly standoff that sent the crowd scattering for cover. You sure you want to do this, Dalton? Jake asked calmly. Killing a respected rancher in front of 50 witnesses might be hard to explain away, even for men with your kind of connections. The gunfighter's scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. Won't be any witnesses left to tell the story, Cowboy. As if on cue, Dalton's men began moving into position, their rifles aimed at the crowd. Jake realized with growing dread that these killers were prepared to murder everyone present to cover their tracks. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with Jake's gun trained on Dalton while 8 rifles aimed at the terrified townspeople. Women clutched their children and men looked desperately for cover that didn't exist. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the scene of impending violence. Jake's mind raced through his options. He was fast with a gun and accurate, but even if he dropped Dalton instantly, the other gunmen would cut down innocent people before he could stop them. He needed a distraction, something to even the odds and give the townspeople a chance to escape. The answer came from an unexpected source. Ayanna, despite her bound hands, had been slowly working her way closer to one of the gunmen positioned near the tree. In a lightning-quick movement, she threw herself sideways into the man's legs, sending him tumbling to the ground and his rifle spinning away. The moment of chaos was all Jake needed. He put a bullet through Dalton's gun hand, sending the scarred man's weapon flying, then dove behind a nearby wagon as rifles began barking all around him. The townspeople scattered like startled birds, some running for the buildings of Willow Creek while others sought shelter behind rocks and trees. Sheriff Bradley, jolted into action by the violence, finally remembered his duty. He drew his own gun and put a bullet into one of Thornfield's hired killers before taking cover behind his office building. Old Sam Jenkins produced a shotgun from somewhere and blasted another gunman off his horse with both barrels, the Apache sisters, showing remarkable courage despite their restraints. had scattered to take advantage of the confusion. Ayanna had freed her hands from the loosely tied ropes and was working to untie her sisters while bullets flew around them. Jake rolled from behind the wagon and came up shooting. His second shot caught a rifleman in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt. But return fire from the remaining gunman was forcing him to keep his head down, and he could see Thornfield attempting to escape on horseback. "Stop that man!" Jake shouted to anyone who could hear him. "He's the one behind all this." A shot rang out from an upstairs window in the general store, and Thornfield's horse reared up, dumping the land speculator hard onto the ground. Martha Collins, the store owner's wife, appeared in the window with a smoking rifle in her hands. "Nobody murders the Patterson family and gets away with it in my town," she called down. The battle was turning, but it was far from over. 3 of Dalton's men were still fighting, using their horses for cover while they tried to regain control of the situation. Worse, Jake could see more dust clouds on the horizon, suggesting additional riders were approaching. Ayanna had succeeded in freeing 2 of her sisters, and the 3 women were now helping the others escape their bonds. Despite the danger, they moved with calm efficiency, showing the kind of courage that came from facing adversity throughout their lives. Dalton, clutching his wounded gun hand, was bellowing orders to his remaining men. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses. We can blame everything on the Apache women." But the tide of battle had shifted decisively. The townspeople, once they realized they were fighting for their lives, had found weapons and courage they didn't know they possessed. Jake saw the blacksmith wielding a massive hammer, chasing one of the gunmen down the street. The preacher had apparently found a rifle somewhere, and was providing covering fire from behind his church. Jake took advantage of the confusion to work his way closer to where Thornfield lay groaning in the dirt. The land speculator was conscious but badly shaken from his fall. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his expensive suit was torn and dusty. "It's over, Thornfield," Jake said, pressing his gun barrel against the man's chest. "Call off your dogs before more people die?" "You don't understand," Thornfield gasped. "This is bigger than just me. The railroad needs that land, and there are people in territorial government who will stop at nothing to get it." "Then they can find another way," Jake replied grimly. "One that doesn't involve murdering innocent families." A bullet whistled past Jake's ear, reminding him that the fight wasn't finished yet. One of Dalton's men had worked his way around behind the buildings and was trying to get a clear shot. Jake rolled away from Thornfield and found new cover behind a water trough. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Jake's heart sank as he realized the reinforcements were arriving. But as the riders crested the hill, he was amazed to see Captain William Hayes of the Territorial Militia leading a full company of soldiers. "Cease fire," the captain's voice boomed across the battlefield. "This is Captain Hayes, Territorial Militia. Lay down your weapons immediately." The arrival of legitimate law enforcement changed everything. Dalton's remaining men, seeing they were now vastly outnumbered, began throwing down their rifles and raising their hands in surrender. The scarred gunman himself tried to make one last desperate play. Drawing a hidden pistol and aiming it at Jake, Ayanna moved faster than anyone could have expected. Free from her bonds and armed with a rifle dropped by one of the fallen gunmen, she put a bullet through Dalton's shoulder before he could fire. The impact spun him around and sent him crashing to the ground, where he lay moaning and defeated. Captain Hayes dismounted and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a career soldier. "Someone want to explain what happened here?" Sheriff Bradley, looking both relieved and ashamed, stepped forward. "Captain, we've uncovered a conspiracy to murder settlers and steal their land for railroad development. These Apache women were framed for the Patterson murders." Jake emerged from cover, still keeping his gun ready in case any of Thornfield's men tried something desperate. "Captain, I can vouch for everything the sheriff just said. We have witnesses and evidence that prove these women are innocent." As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Jake found himself looking at Ayanna with newfound respect. She had shown remarkable courage and skill in the fight, probably saving his life in the process. Captain Hayes' soldiers quickly secured the scene, rounding up the surviving gunmen and providing medical attention to the wounded. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, buzzing with excitement and relief that the immediate danger had passed. But Jake knew the real work was just beginning. They needed to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and ensure that justice was served. Thornfield, under guard but still defiant, glared at Jake with undisguised hatred. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Cowboy. This operation has backing from the highest levels of territorial government. You'll never make charges stick against men with that kind of power." Jake knelt down beside the injured land speculator, his voice calm but determined. "Maybe not, but we're sure going to try. And I suspect once people start talking, we'll find out just how deep this corruption goes." Captain Hayes approached with a grim expression on his weathered face. "Morrison, isn't it? I know your reputation. What exactly are you alleging here?" "Murder, conspiracy, and corruption, Captain," Jake replied. "These men killed the Patterson family to steal their land for railroad development. They framed these Apache women to cover their tracks and planned to murder every witness here today." Ayanna stepped forward, her dignity intact despite the ordeal she and her sisters had endured. "Captain, we have information that might help your investigation. We saw the real killers that night, and we know where they went." Hayes studied the Apache woman with respect. Her calm demeanor and articulate speech clearly impressed him. "I'm listening. We were camped in the hills above the Patterson homestead, planning to trade horses with them the next day," Ayanna explained. "We saw 6 riders approach the house just after dark. They were white men, well-armed and organized. After they killed the family and burned the buildings, they rode north toward Thunder Pass." "Thunder Pass leads to the railroad survey camps," Hayes mused. "That's very convenient for anyone who wanted the Patterson land cleared for development." Sam Jenkins hobbled over, still carrying his smoking shotgun. "Captain, I found more tracks this morning while you were riding in. Someone's been moving a lot of horses and equipment through Thunder Pass recently. Fresh wagon ruts and horse droppings everywhere." The evidence was mounting, but Jake knew they needed more than circumstantial proof to bring down men with powerful connections. He turned to Sheriff Bradley, who had been standing quietly nearby, clearly wrestling with his conscience. "Sheriff, you know more about this than you've been saying," Jake observed. "This is your chance to do the right thing and come clean." Bradley's shoulders sagged as years of fear and compromise finally caught up with him. "They threatened my family, Jake. Said they'd kill my wife and children if I didn't cooperate. I never wanted any part of this." "What exactly did they ask you to do?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice stern but not unsympathetic. "Cover up the real investigation," Bradley admitted. "Make sure the Apache women were blamed and hanged quickly before anyone could ask too many questions." They provided fake witnesses and planted evidence to support their story. Thornfield tried to interrupt. "The sheriff's lying to save his own skin. You can't trust anything he says now." But Hayes silenced him with a sharp look. "Continue, Sheriff." Bradley took a deep breath and launched into his confession. "The Territorial Land Development Company has been systematically targeting homesteaders who refuse to sell their property. They offer insultingly low prices, and when people refuse, accidents start happening. Cattle disappear, buildings catch fire, sometimes whole families just vanish." The captain's face darkened as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "How many families are we talking about?" "At least a dozen over the past 2 years," Bradley replied. "The Patterson murders were just the latest. They're getting bolder because no one has been able to stop them." Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. He had suspected corruption, but the systematic nature of these crimes was worse than he had imagined. "Captain, we need to raid their operation before they can destroy evidence or eliminate more witnesses." Hayes nodded grimly. "Agreed. Sheriff Bradley, you're going to help us make this right. I want detailed information about every person involved in this conspiracy." As Bradley began providing names and locations, Jake noticed that several of Thornfield's captured men were looking increasingly nervous. These were hired guns, not loyal soldiers, and they would likely talk if offered the right incentives. Ayanna approached Jake quietly while the interrogations continued. "There is something else you should know. My people have been watching the railroad camps for weeks. They are bringing in many more men than needed for surveying. Armed men who do no measuring or planning. This revelation added another troubling dimension to the conspiracy. If the railroad company was assembling a private army, they might be planning something even more ambitious than simple land theft. How many men are we talking about? Jake asked. Perhaps 50 or more, Ayanna replied. They are well armed and organized like soldiers. My brother wanted to warn the territorial authorities, but we feared no one would believe Apache warnings about white men's business. Jake cursed under his breath. 50 armed men could control the entire territory if they moved quickly and ruthlessly enough. This wasn't just about stealing some homesteads. This was about seizing control of the entire railroad route and the vast wealth it would generate. Captain Hayes had apparently reached the same conclusion. Jake saw him issuing rapid orders to his sergeants, dispatching riders to summon additional military support. The captain was preparing for what might amount to a small war. Morrison, Hayes called over, I'm placing you in temporary deputy status. We're going to need every experienced fighting man we can get. Jake nodded grimly and checked his weapons. What's the plan, Captain? We hit the railroad camp at dawn tomorrow. If we move fast and hard, we can catch them before they realize their operation has been exposed. But it won't be easy. These aren't simple outlaws we're dealing with. As the afternoon wore on, more details of the conspiracy emerged. The captured gunmen, faced with hanging for murder, began talking freely about their employer's plans. The scope of the corruption reached into the territorial capital itself, involving judges, land commissioners, and even some military officers, but perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the Patterson murders were just a test run. The real target was the entire Willow Creek Valley, home to dozens of families whose land sat directly in the path of the proposed railroad. The development company planned to eliminate everyone who wouldn't sell, blame the attacks on Apache raiders, and then use the Indian threat to justify bringing in their private army to protect the remaining settlers. Dawn approached with deceptive calm across the rugged landscape leading to Thunder Pass. Jake rode alongside, Captain Hayes and 30 territorial militiamen, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp morning air. Behind them, a second column led by Ayanna and her sisters moved silently through the brush, following traditional Apache routes that would bring them above the railroad. Camp undetected, the plan was ambitious but necessary. Intelligence gathered from the captured gunmen had revealed that the conspiracy reached far beyond simple land theft. The Territorial Land Development Company was planning to seize control of the entire railroad corridor, establishing a private empire funded by Eastern investors, who cared nothing for law or justice in the frontier territories. Jake's jaw tightened as he remembered the additional details that had emerged during the night's interrogations. The Patterson family hadn't been randomly selected victims. John Patterson had been a vocal opponent of the railroad route, arguing that it would destroy the valley's agricultural potential and displace dozens of established homesteads. His murder was meant to send a message to other resistors while clearing the way for the company's expansion plans. Remember? Captain Hayes said quietly as they neared the camp. We need to take their leadership alive if possible. Dead men can't testify against their conspirators in the territorial capital. The railroad camp sprawled across a natural depression between two hills, making it easily defensible but also difficult to escape from once surrounded. Jake counted at least 40 men moving around the collection of tents and temporary buildings. Most appeared to be legitimate surveyors and workers, but he could identify the hired guns by their weapons and watchful postures. Through his field glasses, Jake spotted the man he was looking for. Marcus Kellerman, according to the captured gunman, was the military leader of the operation, a former Army officer cashiered for excessive brutality during Indian campaigns. Kellerman now commanded the company's private forces with the same ruthless efficiency he had once brought to legitimate warfare. Kellerman stood near the largest tent, studying maps with two other men Jake didn't recognize. One appeared to be another company official, while the second wore the dusty clothes of a frontier scout. Their intense discussion suggested they were planning something significant, possibly the next phase of their expansion into the valley. The signal came as planned. Ayana's voice carried across the hills in what sounded like a bird call, but was actually a traditional Apache communication. Her people were in position on the ridges above the camp, ready to prevent any escape attempts through the mountain passes. Hayes raised his hand, and the militia column spread out in a wide line. They had trained for this kind of assault, and despite the nervous tension, Jake felt a surge of confidence in their chances. These were experienced frontier soldiers, men who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. "Territorial militia," Hayes's voice boomed across the camp. "You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." The response was immediate and violent. Kellerman's men had been well trained and well positioned. Rifle fire erupted from concealed positions around the camp perimeter, forcing the militiamen to dive for cover behind rocks and trees. Jake found himself pinned behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone inches from his head. The company gunmen were better organized than he had expected, suggesting they had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Someone had warned them, or they had scouts watching the approaches to the valley. The battle quickly developed into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Kellerman's men had the advantage of prepared positions, but the militia held the high ground in superior numbers. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage without taking heavy casualties. From his position, Jake could see that the legitimate workers were caught in the crossfire, many of them unarmed civilians who had no part in the conspiracy. Several had been wounded in the initial exchange of gunfire, and their agonized cries added urgency to the need for a quick resolution. Ayana's contribution proved decisive. Apache warriors appeared like ghosts on the ridges above the camp, their presence forcing Kellerman to split his attention between multiple threats. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Many of the hired guns had fought Indians before and knew how dangerous they could be in their home territory. "Kellerman," Hayes called out during a brief lull in the firing, "this is your last chance to surrender. You're outnumbered and outflanked. There's no escape from this position." The former officer's response was predictable. "Come and take us, Captain. My men are prepared to die here if necessary." But Jake could see cracks beginning to show in the defensive line. Several of Kellerman's gunmen were looking nervously at the Apache positions above them, clearly uncomfortable with their tactical situation. These were men who fought for money, not principle, and they had no desire to die for someone else's schemes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. One of the civilian workers, apparently a surveyor who had been caught up in events beyond his control, suddenly stood up with his hands raised. "Don't shoot," he called out. "I want to surrender. I never signed up for murder and conspiracy." His action triggered a cascade of similar surrenders as other innocent workers realized they had a chance to escape the doomed position. Within minutes, half the camp had given up, leaving only Kellerman and his core group of hired killers to continue the fight. Jake seized the opportunity to advance, moving from cover to cover as he worked his way closer to the command tent. He could see Kellerman and two of his lieutenants barricaded behind overturned supply wagons. Still firing steadily at any target that presented itself, the Apache warriors had begun their own advance, moving with supernatural stealth down the rocky slopes. Jake watched in amazement as Ayana herself appeared behind one of the gunmen's positions, her rifle ready but her finger off the trigger. She was giving the man a chance to surrender before taking his life. Captain Hayes recognized the shifting tide of battle and ordered a final, coordinated assault. Militiamen advanced from multiple directions while the Apache warriors closed off any remaining escape routes. The noose was tightening around Kellerman and his remaining followers, but the former officer wasn't finished fighting. As Jake approached the command area, Kellerman suddenly appeared from behind the supply wagons with a bundle of dynamite in his hands. The madness in his eyes suggested he was prepared to blow up the entire camp rather than face capture and trial. "Stay back," Kellerman screamed. "I'll kill everyone here before I let you take me alive." The standoff with Kellerman holding the dynamite lasted only seconds, but those moments stretched like hours in Jake's mind. The former officer's wild eyes and trembling hands made it clear he was beyond rational thought. Cornered and facing disgrace, he had chosen the path of a madman rather than accept defeat. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. But he knew that shooting Kellerman might cause the man's death grip to trigger the explosives. Too many innocent people were still in the blast radius, including several wounded workers who couldn't move to safety. The solution came from Ayanna, who had positioned herself on a rocky outcrop directly above Kellerman's position. With the fluid grace of a natural hunter, she dropped silently from the rocks and landed behind the crazed officer. Before he could react, her rifle butt connected solidly with the base of his skull, dropping him unconscious to the ground. Jake lunged forward and carefully removed the dynamite from Kellerman's limp fingers, passing it quickly to Captain Hayes, who handed it off to his demolitions expert for safe disposal. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications of what they had discovered were staggering. As the militiamen secured the camp and tended to the wounded, Jake and Hayes examined the contents of Kellerman's command tent. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Maps showed planned attacks on every major homestead in the valley. Lists contained the names of territorial officials who had been bribed or threatened into cooperation. Most damning of all were detailed financial records showing payments from Eastern Railroad interests totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This is bigger than we thought," Hayes muttered, studying a telegram from someone identified only as the senator. "This conspiracy reaches all the way to Washington." Jake examined a particularly damning document that outlined the company's ultimate plan. They intended to control not just the railroad route but the entire territorial government, installing their own puppet officials and using their private army to enforce their will. The Patterson murders were just the beginning of what amounted to a corporate war against the American frontier. Ayanna approached the tent, her face grim but satisfied. "My sisters have found something you need to see. There are wagons hidden in the canyon beyond the camp. Wagons full of stolen goods from murdered families." The discovery of the stolen property provided the final piece of evidence needed to connect the company to multiple murders throughout the territory. Household items, personal belongings, and even children's toys painted a heartbreaking picture of the innocent lives destroyed by corporate greed. Among the recovered items, Jake found John Patterson's distinctive pocket watch, a gift from his father that had been mentioned in newspaper accounts of the murders. The watch served as tangible proof linking the company directly to the crime that had started this entire investigation. As afternoon approached, additional militia units arrived from the territorial capital, along with a federal marshal who had been investigating railroad corruption throughout the Western Territories. Marshal Robert Crawford was a legend in law enforcement, known for his integrity and his willingness to pursue powerful criminals regardless of their political connections. "Gentlemen," Crawford announced after reviewing the evidence, "what you've uncovered here is part of a nationwide conspiracy to defraud the American people and steal public lands. This company and its eastern backers have been operating similar schemes in at least 6 territories. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. The Territorial Land Development Company was just one tentacle of a vast criminal organization that included railroad executives, territorial officials, federal bureaucrats, and even members of Congress. The money involved reached into the millions, representing one of the largest criminal enterprises in American history." Sheriff Bradley, who had accompanied the federal authorities, approached Jake with obvious relief on his face. "Morrison, I can't thank you enough for stopping this. My family is safe now and I can finally do my job honestly again." Jake nodded but remained focused on ensuring that justice was served completely. "What about the people in the territorial capital who were taking bribes? Are they going to face charges too?" Marshal Crawford's smile was grim but satisfied. "Oh yes, they'll face charges. We've been building cases against corrupt officials for months, but we needed evidence like this to make arrests stick. Several territorial judges and the land commissioner will be in federal custody by next week." The cleanup of the conspiracy took weeks, but the results were more comprehensive than Jake had dared hope. Kellerman and his surviving gunmen received lengthy prison sentences for murder and conspiracy. Thornfield turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing details about the Eastern financiers who had funded the operation. More importantly, the stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners or their heirs. The Patterson homestead, along with properties belonging to other murdered families, was set aside for legitimate settlers rather than corporate development. The railroad route was modified to avoid displacing established communities, ensuring that progress didn't come at the cost of innocent lives. Ayanna and her sisters were formally recognized by the territorial government for their crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. The false charges against them were officially dropped, and they received a monetary reward for their assistance in bringing the criminals to justice. Captain Hayes recommended Jake for a commendation from the territorial governor, praising his courage and determination in uncovering the plot. But for Jake, the real reward was simpler and more personal. He had prevented the murder of 7 innocent women and helped restore justice to a territory that had been corrupted by greed and violence. As autumn arrived in the valley, Jake often rode past the rebuilt Patterson homestead, now occupied by a young family from Kansas who had purchased the land honestly. Children played in the yard where tragedy had once struck, their laughter a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Ayanna visited occasionally, bringing news from her people and updates on the ongoing federal investigations. The friendship forged in crisis had developed into mutual respect and understanding between two very different cultures, united by a common commitment to justice. The railroad eventually came to the valley, but on terms that benefited legitimate settlers rather than corporate raiders. The tracks curved around established homesteads and respected traditional Apache sacred sites. Progress and preservation found a balance that honored both the future and the past. Years later, when people spoke of the events that came to be known as the Thunder Pass War, they remembered it not as a victory of one group over another, but as proof that courage and justice could triumph over corruption and greed. Jake Morrison's name became legend throughout the territory, but he remained the same honest rancher he had always been, content to work his land and protect his neighbors from those who would do them harm. The 7 Apache sisters returned to their people with a story that would be told around tribal fires for generations. They had faced death with dignity and helped expose a conspiracy that threatened everyone in the territory, regardless of race or background. Their courage became an inspiration to both Apache and white settlers, proving that justice knows no boundaries when good people stand together against evil.